There was a time right before my bone marrow transplant where I definitely was nervous. I mean, it was really touch and go. My family was, kind of spread out all over, and I really always kept like a very low profile. And I remember calling my mom and being like, I think you should come here. I think you should come to my house and see me, because I really didn't know what was going to happen.
Welcome to A Place of Yes, a podcast about how I moved through my darkest hour. So I am here today with a very special guest, and she's a special guest because she's one of my dearest friends. It didn't come to me right away that I wanted you on the show. It came to me when I was recording Melissa Allen's episode, and we were talking about Liv. And I guess I'm going in right heavy. I was going to do this whole really kind of great introduction, but I'm going right in. And we talked so much about Liv and her battle with blood cancers and leukemia and all of those things. And one of the things that I love so much about you is that you have so much going on in your life. And you just, in kind of Liv Allen fashion, you fight with a smile. I just was sitting here talking to Melissa, and I just kept thinking of you the whole time. We all have our crosses to bear and all of our things, but you fight a pretty big battle all the time, and no one really knows it. I mean, I know people know it, but no one really knows it. But before we go super deep, because that did not even give you any transition or even a chance to say hi, let's talk about how we met.
So I remember reading about Jake's and hearing about Jake's, and I just loved that you took a tragedy and made it into something beautiful. I love that it was really a grassroots organization and that all the money stayed local. That was a really, really big deal. It's a very big deal to me in terms of philanthropy. So I don't even know. I feel like I looked up your number. I think I was doing something with the Gabby Rocco Foundation, I think.
Yes.
A fundraiser. And then I think it just kind of poured into the other. And I found your number and on the World Wide Web. And
the World Wide Web.
Gave you a call.
I remember being like, why?
Yeah.
like who's just calling me? Because you were like, I'd love to pick a day, and I'd love to have a day at the store where all of the profits go to Jake's Help from Heaven. And for those who don't know, let me do a proper introduction. This is Allie Hall. She is the owner of Piper Boutique in Saratoga Springs. Piper Boutique, for those who don't know, is just this super fun women's store on Broadway in Saratoga. What I love about it is that I have some of my most comfortable clothes that I own from there, and I also have some of my most fun dresses.
Yes.
And for those who are not local to the area, piperboutique.com is always available. So the store Piper has been around for quite some time. How long?
Yeah, 14, almost 15 years.
15 years in Saratoga. It was just this really great opportunity, really, where you were like, let's just pick a day and all the proceeds go. And I remember just working with your staff, and what a fun day. I think we brought champagne. Fun. We had some
so fun. I feel like it went 5 hours longer than
I think I showed up with and a couple of friends with champagne and some snacks, and then we just turned it into
just a party.
We just turned it into a party. Somehow through that, we just became friends.
Yeah.
It went from being this relationship of like you said, philanthropy. You were always very generous with Jake's, but then we just legitimately became friends. Yeah. And now all those years later, I find you to be one of my dearest friends. We just have a good time.
Yeah, I think that was 2012.
So you have always been, and you talked a little bit about this, but in the last 10 plus years, you've started doing, you worked on some committees with Jake's. You also have come on some deliveries. Can you talk a little bit about that?
My first delivery, I think, we did one in Mechanicville.
Yes.
I'm pretty sure. And I remember not really knowing what to expect. It was my first delivery, and I had obviously seen, photos on Facebook, but I remember taking this deep breath before we went inside and just saying don't cry, don't get emotional. But it was so heartwarming because we were delivering a feeding chair, and it was right before Thanksgiving, and the family had said, they had never been able to eat together. They fed their daughter and then they ate. And I remember just breathing and my eyes just welled up with how beautiful that was. I mean, I always felt very strongly about the organization, but it was really a turning point for me when I was just wow, this is really what this is about.
It's exactly what I want deliveries to be,
Yeah.
right? Like where you can immediately see the impact you're making. When people are, I think sometimes, especially as I think of being like Jake's mom, and I think of some of the kids that we help through Jake's Help from Heaven, and when I think of sickness, and this will kind of segue into a little bit of that, but it can feel so isolating and it can feel so alone. When we can make those differences and we can make those impacts on the families, it just makes such a difference.
I think the big moment for me in seeing it, like something that you take for granted, you take for granted the ability to sit with your family and have dinner and just talk, just have an experience with, your children and your spouse, your partner. And I knew insurance didn't cover a lot of things, but it was just something that shouldn't be a luxury. And it felt like a luxury to them. And that was really what I left with that day, was like, wow, this is something so simple that, other
It's like eating a meal.
do. Yeah. And it's something that's so impactful.
When you're dealing with profound sickness, or when you're dealing with life, if everything is going well for you, can still sometimes be hard, right? Like for our families, for people with illness, there's just these added extra things. And kind of, I like the way you sort of said it. It's things that shouldn't be luxuries become them.
Yeah.
I don't know when I found out about your personal health struggles, and I don't think I knew them right away. I don't necessarily think it's something you hide, but it's something you're not very forthcoming about. And then I remember we were talking or something, and I feel like you said something, and I was like, oh shit, am I supposed to know this? And I did it, and then we talked about it. So if you are comfortable, will you talk a little bit about your initial struggles with cancer and that? I mean, it's obviously part of your story.
So for me, I remember I was 23 years old. I had just signed a lease on my store. I was recently engaged, and I remember thinking like, wow, my life is perfect. Yeah. Everything feels easy. Like my biggest concern was, was my business going to be successful? Like any new business owner.
And prior to doing that, you worked in New York City, you worked in finance, you graduated early. So you were on a direct path.
So I think the hardest thing for me was everything had kind of gone to plan. I graduated high school young, went to college, graduated in 3 years, got a job in finance at 20, and then left for a job in New York City in licensing for Marc Jacobs before I came back here. And I had never really had adversity. I felt like my life up until that point had been really smooth. And when I started building out the store, like I said, I was putting my life savings into this business, and that was my biggest concern. And then you get that phone call. It's, like anyone would say who's dealt with health stuff, it's like one of those moments that's just like burned in your brain.
Well, it's like there's the before and the after.
Yeah. And I remember I had just gotten back from Home Depot. I was actually buying paint for the store, and I left my phone at my house, which is very uncharacteristic of me. And I had like 4 missed calls from a doctor and I'm like, that's so weird. And I called back, left a voicemail, and then they called me after hours, and I had a growth in my uterus, and I had a lot of pre-testing leading up to that, but that was the first thing. And at the time I remember thinking, okay, this is this one thing. Blood cancer wasn't even on my radar. But I always tell people, like, I was young, I was in tip-top shape. And I remember taking a deep breath when I got that phone call. And it sounds so ridiculous to say, but thinking like, but I did everything right. Like I never smoked. I don't drink.
Unless I bully you.
Right. I mean, I bought the organic vegetables and all of the crap you're supposed to do. And I'm like, are you sure you have the right person? Because I don't feel like that at all.
Let me stop you for 1 second, because I think you just touched on something that almost every guest of the show and just conversations, it's that grappling with, but wait, why? Like, why me? But also like, but I did everything right. Because I remember, I mean, I think I've even said something very similar to that. Because, when Jake got sick, like, just literally one day he was a healthy 8-month-old. Life of the party at Ethan's second birthday party. And then I would never have guessed that was the last time like I would see him laugh or the last time I would see him, sit unassisted. Do you still grapple with that?
Not or have anymore. You come? I'm kind of numb to it now, but I remember when I first had my surgery thinking that it was over. I was able to really get through that. And then
So they found the growth and then the treatment was surgery.
The surgery. I did a follow-up with oncology, and that's when they were like, you have a blood cancer, and it's something that you might have for the rest of your life. Like you can go in and on and off of chemos, but blood cancer just felt more serious to me. Like
well,
it
even now when you're
felt,
saying that, and even though
yeah,
I know that is your like diagnosis,
yeah,
like I sit here and I'm like,
yeah.
it's shocking.
It just felt very real. And I remember this moment where, I knew that I had to start treatment. And I remember going out to lunch with one of my friends, and she was really adamant about taking a photo of us. Like, and I'm not a big photo person. And I saw her looking at the photo after she took it. And I could just tell, like, oh my God, this girl who's
She's worried.
is worried. Like, she's concerned that like this is going to be
Oh God.
the last photos. And that was actually, oddly enough, like the moment where it really hit me, like, this is real.
And were you 24,
So then
25?
I was 24 at that point, and I had just kind of emotionally gotten over, the fact of, what had happened with my uterus. It's done. And
like
then
you close that door and you're moving on.
yeah, and I was really, just focused on work. I was opening my store, and then I do remember going to my primary care and saying, I feel really tired. But other than that, I felt normal. I wasn't, losing weight. My skin tone was fine. It didn't seem like
you didn't have any of the things that would be like, wait, something's off.
Like my perception of cancer was like what you see in the movies.
Yes.
That was my only real perception of it. So I didn't feel like that. But I remember going to my primary and just saying, I don't feel great. Like I feel, but the trouble is, not just as a woman, but as a business owner, it's so easy for doctors to say, well, you're burning the candle at both ends.
Yeah.
When you're 24, you can burn the candle at both ends. And I just remember thinking, I don't know, I really shouldn't feel like this.
I shouldn't feel like this.
I shouldn't feel sick. And I remember actually leaving the doctors and thinking, like, am I crazy? Like, is this in my head?
But I feel like with the conversations that I've been having, it is so common.
Yeah.
And I struggle with what do we do about that, right?
Yeah.
Like, how do we get like our medical system, our doctors to pay more attention? And I think you did hit it when you said, being a woman, and maybe it's the same for men as well. I don't always tend to think it is. But, when we were talking, I had mentioned, when we first started this conversation talking about Melissa and Liv had those same like, she knew something was wrong. Like, or was like, I shouldn't, or kind of, I think more accurately was like, I shouldn't feel this way.
Yeah.
I'm 17, I'm 18 years old. Like, why am I so tired? I don't know what needs to be done, but something should, right? Like there should be some validity in the fact that you are 24 years old. And there should be some trust in us as women, I think, that we know our body.
Yeah.
So that it's not just, oh, you're working too hard.
But I've heard this story frequently from people who have had diagnosis, and they do go to the doctor multiple times, and they say
before they get anything,
I don't feel well. And I remember the doctor, and actually Liv's mom said this too, and I remember her being like, well, maybe you're pregnant.
I remember when she said that, I was like, are you kidding me?
And I when I saw the episode, I saw that Melissa said that, and I was just like, no, I'm not. And then it was like, well, maybe it's hormones. And I'm like, I'm 24.
You're not 13 and just start, you know what I mean? Like where you're trying to figure out what it is to deal with what women deal with. Like
I still had 70% of my uterus. My ovaries were intact. It wasn't hormonal, and getting my hormones checked regularly, and my thyroid. But I feel that doctors just kind of do brush things off. You're a person who was able to advocate for your child. I'm a person that can advocate for myself or for others. And it just is so eye-opening to God, if you can't advocate, then you don't stand a chance.
If we can't get answers or get things that make sense, then what are the what does that say for other people? I think that's a huge point. Another thing you said that I connected to very much, which I hadn't thought about, but you were saying like, you couldn't believe blood cancer. Yes, it sounds so scary and so huge. And it is. But when you think of cancer, you have a very specific image in your head. Mm-hmm. There's just so much we don't know.
Yeah. I mean, you really, until you know, you don't.
You don't know.
You don't
I mean,
know.
it's the simplest thing, but it's very true.
You only really know what you've been exposed to. And that was, I guess what I had been exposed to, not exposed to in person, but I, thought cancer was like a different path. Like I was like, oh, okay, a person doesn't feel well. They go to the doctor, then they run lab work, then they like a very traditional kind of diagnosis.
Or to your point earlier, something that like, okay, if you smoke, you're probably going to get lung cancer. The world conditions you sometimes to think that like if A, then B, you know what I mean? But never just these random stories, the random story of Jake, the random story of yours. Like you said, you're healthy, you're 23, you're at the prime of your life.
It impacted me emotionally. And the interesting thing was I actually had my first bone marrow biopsy up here, and they came back and said, it looks all right. Let's keep monitoring it. I have a friend who's a nurse practitioner, Sasha Crowley, and she looked at my lab work and she just said, there's no way that your bone marrow biopsy would be okay.
So she diagnosed it.
So she was just a customer at the time. I mean, an
Okay.
acquaintance, but I don't know what possessed me to ask her, but I remember her saying, can I ask you something weird? And she was like, yeah. I said, do you mind looking at these lab results? And I actually had a copy printed out. And she looked at them and I said, but my bone marrow biopsy was normal. And she said, that's not possible. It's not. So I had a repeat bone marrow biopsy at Sloan Kettering.
So did you ask, so you said to the doctor,
Yeah.
I'm not comfortable with these results. I want to do them again. Or like, how did you advocate for yourself? Because that's kind of big to go up against.
I asked for the slides for the bone marrow biopsy and I had them sent to Sloan. And
had you already have a doctor at Sloan? Like were you already?
No, I didn't. No, I wasn't established there. And they said, there's so much bone fragment in this biopsy. It's not even, you can't even use it for diagnostic. Yeah, it's inconclusive. And you can't even use it for diagnostic purposes. So I don't really know why anyone would give you an answer to monitor something, because the specimen, I guess, or the sample was really kind of contaminated with bone fragment, if that's the right word. So I had to do a repeat bone marrow biopsy at Sloan.
How does that work at Sloan? Because I know that anybody can ask them.
It's probably more like portal oriented now. At the time, it was like 10 years ago, but I remember like calling a 1-800 number that I looked online, just like I called you, just blindly calling people and saying, I had this bone marrow biopsy. These are my lab results. Can I send both to you? And they said the exact same thing. Like, there's no way.
It doesn't match.
This doesn't match. Yeah. So we're going to do repeat testing. And they did another bone marrow biopsy and it was completely different. I mean, it was a diagnostic bone marrow biopsy. And that kind of started the ball rolling. I've been with them for quite some time and it's been a whole journey of ups and downs. And, I think the hard part is like, you can't get your hopes up, because the second you're like, okay, I'm good. Like then something else hits. I mean,
have you ever had like a moment where you feel like I'm cured?
So I have polycythemia. That's what I've had for an extended period of time. And then it piggybacked into erythroleukemia, which is a different type of, I've always had red blood cell cancers. I feel like leukemia is generally only known as white blood cell, but I've always had red blood cell. And polycythemia you always have. So I knew.
So you're never.
Yeah, I knew it was just it was just going to be a lifelong chronic journey. But it's when the other things pop up that I'm like, okay, this is not.
You're like, isn't this enough?
Yeah, like it's always, of course, at the worst times.
Currently you are in a pop-up.
I'm in the thick of it at the moment. It's just been a really kind of tumultuous journey. And like, I mean, I had a stroke. That was one thing, which again, not something you expect to be having. And I remember, I went to the eye doctor. I went to Family Vision Care.
When was this?
And then I think 2016. And I had been having kind of blurry vision. And I actually kind of like what Melissa was saying, I had this like bruise on my arm and I thought, oh my gosh, this is weird. It seems like, WebMD is telling me this could be a clot, but everyone says don't use that. And it's not a great resource for diagnostics, but
it's a good resource for basic information, right?
So
like
I called one of the doctors and they were like, well, no, you're not overweight. You don't smoke. You're not on estrogen-based birth control. So it's not a clot. In retrospect, I'm like, but I have a red blood cell cancer that causes clots. So why?
But sometimes, right? Like no matter how smart we are, we defer to what the expert is telling us because they're supposed to be the experts and they're supposed to know more than us.
Yeah. Yeah. When I spoke with them and they were like, no, I'm sure it's not, a clot. I was like, well, I sell dresses for a living. Yeah. So this is a specialist. I'm sure they know what they're talking about. And then when I went to the eye doctor, I immediately had to get an MRI and go to the emergency room. And
so what did they see?
That day in my mind is a little hazy because of ultimately I had a stroke at the end. But I think it was that my optic nerve was just not, your eyes kind of like tell a story of what's going on in your brain earlier onset than when things actually happen. So, or what I do remember of it is that my eye just didn't look right inside. I think my optic nerve on my left side was pretty dead at the time. And I did have, as I was going to the ER, that's when like the facial paralysis started. And I had some like tingling in my arms, but I felt like my vision wasn't great. And I called and they had a cancellation.
So you happened to be able to get in.
And I was like, you know what? I probably need glasses. So meanwhile, my vision is, rapidly declining because I'm like edging towards a stroke. Yeah, that was, again, one of those moments I was just like, oh my God, what is going on? Like, why me? I mean, it just didn't make sense. But, you just kind of go with it. You listen to doctors. But I mean, I haven't followed a direct path that every doctor has given me. There's some things that I've really pushed back on. I mean, there have been medications that, I've talked to you about it where there's like serious mental health side effects. And I just have known, that's unless it's 100% fix, like I'm not willing to
risk any of
put myself through that. I've had to really advocate where, doctors have said, stay on this medication. It could be beneficial, but you have to take care of yourself mentally.
Do you think so? Now you're what, like 10 plus years into this? I mean, you must feel to some degree that you can start to trust your instinct a little bit too,
Definitely.
right? Like, I mean, you obviously have to not follow, but like do as the doctors say. But I think even the fact when you're like, wait, I don't want to take this medicine because look at these side effects and I can't so maybe we're addressing the blood cancer issue, but now we're going to create another issue because I'm going to be depressed. It's such a hard lesson to learn because it's coming at your personal expense, right?
Yeah.
Like it's like quality of life and all of those things.
Well, it is totally quality of life. I mean, I need to be able to get up in the morning and get to work and work with customers. Like I have a front-facing business where I'm speaking with people all day and they're coming in to be helped. So it's a customer service business. And, I can't be sitting in my back room crying.
Yeah. And I mean, so we have talked about this. So you've been on this journey for so long. And on the outside, right? Like, so not the conversations you have with good friends and not that, but I really do think that a lot of people have zero idea about what you go through and the severity of it.
Yeah.
Because I do think sometimes people are like, oh, wait, she had cancer. She's a survivor. She's like, or there's almost sometimes, and I don't want to say the detriment because I think it's not the detriment. I think it's what keeps you going, right? Like you just said, like it's not like every day you want to be there talking to customers, but that that's part of what keeps you
absolutely
in the game, in the battle.
The first thing I tell people when they have a diagnosis is try to maintain your life as normal as possible. For me, it's what has kept me going. And has kind of, I would say, balanced out like my grieving journey in terms of how I thought my life was going to be.
Well, so I mean, so that segued right into this sort of
Yeah.
The other reason why I thought you were great for this show, because as you know, it started as a very traditional grief podcast as an avenue for me to talk about the loss of Jake. It remains a grief podcast, but the conversations we've had with so many people are not just that traditional, like, I've lost someone important to me.
Right.
Like all of that, we've grief is universal, right? Like we all, if we haven't had loss, we are going to have loss. Yeah. But there is also this other grief that is out there that is exactly what you just started to say. It's grieving the life you thought you were going to have. Where are you in that? Like in sort of that balance of like, everyone when they're a kid, right? You think you're going to grow up in A, B, C, and D. Some of that is probably different.
The big difference is, when I first got sick, I was very young. So my friends were also very young. Yeah. And I think the hardest part for me has been seeing my peers take my friends, my acquaintances, customers my age taking a totally different journey than I'm taking. And that's hard. I mean, I remember the first time a gynecologist said to me, like, you will not be able to carry. You will get another clot. Like your hormones from pregnancy will cause your body just to choose one or the other. And that's what she said. If you choose to have a baby, I mean, it will kill you or you will have a miscarriage and there's no in between. And that's a tough pill to swallow when you're sitting naked and vulnerable at a gynecology
and
office.
They're like, oh, hey, by the way.
In a paper vest.
Yeah.
But not being a mom has been, and I've very much come to terms with it now, was probably the hardest thing for me. And
especially as you see your friends.
See my friends have kids and, their kids are older and everyone just, says the same kind of thing. Well, you could do surrogacy and you could do this, but there's a bigger piece of that puzzle. And it's that I don't know my future for my health. And I don't want to have a child and then that child doesn't have a mom when that's something that I could control. That's hard though. I mean, you're really trying to make selfless choices when, you don't know what you're going to regret.
You want to be selfless, but sometimes you want to be selfish.
Yeah.
Everything you just said, like they are like, that's huge. You know
It's
what I
hard.
mean? It's
Yeah.
it's huge. It's hard. It's part of what I think is so remarkable about you is that you make these decisions and you live this life based on these decisions that are very selfless and are very difficult and very complex. Yet to most people who walk into Piper, you're just this like gorgeous young business owner who's got, you know what I mean, whose world is perfect, right? And I just like sometimes I feel like I want to take that burden from you because I just want, not that I want people to know your private business, but I want people to know the depth behind you and the depth, like the reason why you do the things you do.
I mean, especially this time of year, because it's customers that are coming in, you know, they're here for track season. And there are days where, you know, I've been feeling my worst. And I quite honestly look in the mirror in my back room and like put on lipstick and I'm like, all right, time for the show, you know? One of the hardest parts, which I'm so grateful for, but also can be really tough, is like you do have survivor's guilt. When you have had a journey as long as I have had, people naturally, when they know someone that does get cancer, say, oh, you should call Allie. You should talk to her. You should, which I'm always happy to do. But then
it weighs on you.
It weighs on you, you know, and you want to offer the right advice. And someone called me and said, you know, I just got diagnosed with prostate cancer. And I'm like, I don't have a prostate.
Yeah. Like I have nothing to offer.
That's one I really can't give much advice on because that's not an anatomy that I have. It goes both ways because, you know, I come in contact with so many people who go through illnesses and I see them get better.
Yeah.
Knowing that that's not my journey.
Yeah.
On the flip side, I see people who don't get better and who do pass. And then it's like, well, it's tough. I mean, you do have survivor's guilt. It's hard sometimes to not be bitter. It's hard when you know, see this, you're so happy for someone's like beautiful success story. You know, they went through their scheduled 8 weeks and then everything was fine forever and they're in remission for the rest of their life. And obviously that's something that everyone wishes for. And I want that for every single person. But then it's like, well, why can't I have that?
Why can't I have it too? It's hard to be okay with our stories all of the time.
Yeah. And the whole story.
Yes.
You know, there's parts that you're so grateful for, but then on the flip side, you know, the part that I'm grateful for is that it has led me to meet so many amazing people and help them along the way. But then there's parts that you do have that kind of like deep breath moment and you can't compare. Like no two journeys are the same. And, you know, it is tough. It's tough when you see the things that you want, like your child to live longer or, you know, to get really clean scans every single year. And you want that. And you just know it's not going to happen. And that's really, really tough.
What do you do like for like a support system? Do you want more people to know or do you like keeping it private because you don't like where do you fall on that?
I feel like I fall a little bit in between. It's tough because you don't want it to just completely dominate
or define who you are.
Of your life, right? Like there are days where I have just no desire to talk about it.
Of course.
Like I'm just like, yeah, I'm fine, whatever. Even when I'm not fine. But then, you know, there's moments where you really like need to like lean in on close friends. Like when we've taken walks and I've, you know, talked to you about it, but it's so all over the place on how I feel about it. Like it's definitely, I would say, out of my comfort zone to talk about it, but like on a more public platform. But I also feel like, you know, if my journey can help someone else who's maybe not in the exact same, you know, path in terms of oncology, but really going through an extended period of frustration and trauma and, you know, grieving certain aspects of their life, then it's worth it. You know, it is worth it. And I feel rewarded when people do get to the end of the closure of their journey and they just say like, thank you so much for,
helped me along the way.
You know, the text messages at, you know, midnight when I was freaking out or things like that. That really is rewarding. But then, like I said, you know, your perception kind of changes day to day. I mean, I'm sure there's moments where you don't want to talk about your grief.
No, 100%. Because, you know, there's two parts I was thinking when you're saying. One is like, you're still you. You don't want this to be your defining character, right? Like, because it's piece of your it's your battle, but it's not who you are, right? Like, I mean, same thing with grief, right? Like, it's a piece of who I am. It's such a reminder, I think, and this is very simple, but it's also like, it's a reminder to me. I hope it's a reminder to everybody people who may be listening to this who didn't know this part of your story, like we truly have no idea what goes on in other people's lives, right?
Absolutely.
Like we just don't. And I like whether it's loss, whether it's grief, whether it's trauma, whether it's sickness, like whatever it is, like you just don't know. The world has moved away from being a compassionate place.
Yeah.
And I think that we have an obligation in some ways to help it become more, by kind of leading, like leading in a way where like, so what if you're late to a meeting? You have like, who cares? It doesn't really impact you. So what if I'm grumpy? I'm sorry if I hurt, you know what I mean? Like sometimes we just have to let people be because we don't have any idea. Like you're sharing a really personal something that is, I mean, I wish this so differently for you, but like as of this time, this is your cross to bear, right? Like this is not, we're going to be better in 3 weeks. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, it's not like that it defines you, but we have to, like, people don't know that. And I think we have to just give people more grace. And I say that to myself too.
It has been hard. There have been times where, I've said it to you. It's like people just say the absolute crazy stuff. It is.
So share some of that because we talk about this.
So I went through a long period where, people would say, well, when is it going to be over? When are you going to be in remission? And I would tell them what they wanted to hear. Well, I have this one more session or a few more sessions and then I have another bone marrow biopsy and then I should be good, and I would say this like almost trying to convince myself.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say there's some of that too, right?
And I would tell people what made them feel comfortable. And then I just finally got to a point where I was like, you know what? It's never going to get better. We're just rolling with it. I'm just dealing with it. I'm just kind of taking it as it comes, living day to day. But people say things that and it's not their fault.
No,
it's not their fault. And
very few people are saying things to be hurtful.
I feel like no one, if people are, they're really,
then that's on them.
That's on them. I mean, I don't know a lot of people that like come at people who have, experienced grief from loss or health or whatever, but those people can't be helped. But I think people oftentimes say something and then they like immediately wish they
took
slurp that back in. I will say, oh, this is what's going on. Or I just say it's fine. But if, I tell someone that I don't really know, they'll say, oh, I know someone that happened to, but they died. And I'm like,
awesome.
Or it's the other side. They're like, well, I know someone that went through, this, that, and the other thing. And then now she has 3 healthy children and everything's fine. And it's just, there's no right or wrong thing to say. And one of my best friends asked me, what do you say? Like, what is the right thing to say when something like this happens? And I just said, just say this up. That sucks.
Yeah. That's kind of my go-to answer too, and different things. But like, you don't have to say anything to make us feel better, right?
Yeah.
You just have to acknowledge where we're at. It can be that simple. Like, I'm so sorry that happened to you.
Yeah.
But I think people always feel like because it's so big,
right,
that they have to offer something big.
Right.
And I think that's where it gets lost a little bit. So what do you do for like your mental health? Like, I know you're super close with your mom. Like, I mean, like, what are the things you do to keep yourself? Because I do think you keep yourself pretty positive, at least on the outside.
I mean, there are days when I stay in bed for sure. And I think just listening to my body is the most important thing. That's what I tell people to do. Like, don't feel like you can't cancel things, reschedule them for a time where you feel better. And I really try to just pour myself into charity work. I mean, that's what I love to do. And it's my feeling of giving back. And I always say, like, when you don't have kids, people assume your life has no purpose. So at least if I do this, then it feels like a more purposeful life. I joke that, whenever something does happen, that there's like this hiccup in my health, I'll always say like, well, I feel like I have so many karmic credits. Like, I don't understand. I do all of this charity work. Like,
I'm ready to cash one in now.
I want my karmic credit coupons. Like, why is this happening? But yeah. And then I remind myself it could be way, way worse. So maybe my karmic coupons
maybe they've been in play,
being cashed in. That's like the way I channel, the stress that I feel is to try to help other people. I know that sounds really weird.
No. So I want to say, I had this in my mind to ask you earlier, and we touched on a little bit like the mental health aspect and how, you sometimes have to protect your mental health. Do you find that there are supports out there? Do you find that there's like therapy or places that you can go to when you are struggling with where you are?
Yeah. I mean, I've been in therapy proudly, consistently this entire time. I do think there's like a gap in accessibility to therapists that
That have
specialize. Yeah.
like for if you have chronic,
Right.
severe
Or
living
your
with a
child
journey.
does,
Yeah.
and I think there's a lot of
No,
therapists where, you have corporate stress
Yeah.
or you have issues in your marriage or
or
anxiety,
parental or
eating
yeah.
disorders,
Like you're right. I think
all
there's
sorts of
very
things.
more typical categories, and it's
Right.
harder to find.
Right. It's kind of a niche market, I guess, where the same person that is an incredible therapist to a typical person,
Yeah.
I have not found someone that specializes just in like health journeys.
So you typically see someone
like a regular
regular therapist.
You're talking to someone who has not experienced your journey. Like if you're going to
like a grief counselor,
like unless they've actually been through that, they're not going to have a real roadmap.
It does become, because some of these things are so niche, almost, right? Like, because until you've lived it, you don't know, and honestly, I had someone here the other day we were talking about, and he lost his son. So when you lose a child, they kind of talk about this club you're in, right? And he was like, I didn't realize how important that club is. Like, you don't want to be in it, but he's like, the only thing that made me feel better when I lost my son was when someone else had also lost their child.
Yeah.
And sometimes we would not even exchange more than 10 words, but we felt better. And he's like, it was the only thing that made him feel better for a chunk of time. And I suspect that is similar feelings, right? Because you don't want to be super vulnerable and share all of these things with someone who has absolutely no idea what you're going through.
When I had my Philadelphia store, there was a customer that came in who actually had the exact same diagnosis I had, which was so bizarre. My store was really close to the hospital, and she was getting treatment. And I'd never asked her, what's wrong with you? But she was very like forthcoming. And I remember just being like, oh my God, that's what I have.
Do you still connect with
phone
her?
numbers? Yeah. And like, she'll share, like if she sees something in like a medical journey or journal, and I'll share things with her. But if you find someone who's been through it, like it's really important.
Well, it also, at least for me, it sort of validates your feelings, right? Because you can have all the friends in the world, and you can have your mom and like a support system of people who are there for you. It's not the same as someone who has stepped exactly in it, and
even like, between spouses or, parenting caregivers, like I talk about this with some of my friends who, they're going through treatment, and they'll come home and their spouse is like, oh God, I have such a headache.
You're like, okay, great. Yeah.
And, 3 months ago, that would have been fine. Like, you're just, oh, honey, I'm sorry. But in that moment, you're like, are you serious?
You're telling me this right now.
Like, you're seriously telling me that and
it's hard because there's that whole, like, there's that, I've read about some of these things, right? Where it's like, it's this catch-22 almost, because the person who is saying, oh, I have a headache, like, will say like, well, we're married, I should be able to complain about what I want to complain about. But the person who's going through something much more significant than a headache is like, what do you want me to do about that? I just went through, chemo, and I'm threw up 3 times on the way home or so, you know what I mean? Like,
and friends too. Yeah. They don't, like, goes back to what we were talking about. Like, they don't mean it, but like when people are like, how are you feeling? I'm like, I'm good, I'm tired. They're like, oh my God, I am so tired. I'm not sleeping well. I'm exhausted. I'm watching TikToks all night. And I'm like,
awesome.
All right. I'm happy that you acknowledge that. Like, and they don't, people do. It's like people say the darnest things, I remember like when I first did chemo, my mom said to me, my hair was thinning and whatever. And she said, I wish we could trade places. I wish it was me going through it and not you. And I remember looking at her, and it wasn't even like I was trying to make her laugh and saying, well, I'm glad it's not you, because then if you went bald, I would feel like I had to shave my head because I was your daughter, and you have kind of big ears, and I don't think you would look good bald. And I meant it like really, really seriously, but she was like, oh my God, it just cracked her up. And I'm like, that would be really awkward. At least,
you're like, at least we're not dealing with that.
At least we're not dealing with that. I do feel like I spend a lot of time thinking about how to really shelter her from it. And I mean, she obviously knows everything that happens, but it's like anything. You don't always want to just be an open book, or maybe some days you want to be an open book.
And some days you want to be very closed.
And some days you don't. But I guess I just take it day to day.
Are you scared? Like, are you afraid that you are going to die young?
There was a time right before my bone marrow transplant where I definitely was nervous. I mean, it was really touch and go. My family was, kind of spread out all over. And I really always kept like a very like low profile. And I remember calling my mom and being like, I think you should come here. I think you should come to my house and see me, because I really didn't know what
How it
was
was
going
gonna
to
play out.
happen. When a person dies, it's like the hardest part is the people you leave behind, So I myself have never been afraid to have something happen to myself, but to think of like the people that just kills me. I mean, that's the kind of thing that really does keep me just like pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing.
And fighting the fight.
Yeah, and fighting the fight, because, I think of like my godchildren or my siblings or my friends or anyone. And it's like, that is like, that's actually the worst part of everything.
Is thinking about
if something happens, what will your family like have? And I think that's a big part of, I guess, to answer your question, in terms of my life changing, I feel like I'm really in touch with like, what would my legacy be? Like if something were to happen tomorrow or a year from now, like what would people remember? And that's why, I do a lot of charity work, and I try to make really good connections with people, and I try to help with my friends' kids and be there for impactful moments in their lives.
You live, and I think you do that very well. Like you live very intentionally.
Yeah.
I don't like thinking about the reason why you have to do that or why you do that, for you to know that it does show, right? Like I think that it's, I, as someone who has lost someone, I kind of can get irritated with people, not appropriately, like when I feel like people don't respect life, right? Because life is a gift, and life is, Jake never had a chance really.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know it when I was actively parenting him, but he never had a chance. He had no diagnosis. He had this crazy thing, like his journey was kind of spelled out for him. And there's people who are fighting the fight all day, every day. And then there's people who don't value life. And it's hard for me to find that balance. And I just want you to know that it's very clear to me that you are fighting that, and you're doing a really honorable and great job of the way that you live. I think you balance it really well. And it is an honor to know you and be your friend.
It was an honor to be asked to do this. Things that you've done for the community, for Jake and because of Jake, is a tremendous legacy. That's something that even though why you do it is like it's a terrible reason, it's a terrible grief, but I feel like having that legacy to know all of the lives that you've touched
feels good.
So it feels really good. It's, it's not going to take away whether, me doing charity work or you having Jake's, like it's not going to take away that reason of pain, but it does kind of smooth out some of the day-to-day hardships, I think.
We ask our guests sometimes, it's called Ask Heather Anything. So you got a chance here to ask me anything.
Oh God, I don't know.
Pressure.
I guess the thing that I've always wondered is like, and actually we've talked about this, is do you feel like Ethan being at college is such like a bittersweet thing?
Oh, I feel like when he went to college, it was like the hardest thing, second to losing Jake. But I will say now, this summer, and having spent since like May with him and seeing the human that he is, I am like so filled with like joy and pride. And last summer was about, and him going to college was about me like missing the little boy.
Mm-hmm.
And like, how did this go so fast? And the whole like days are long, but the years are short, like that whole nonsense. This year is about embracing what it is to have a young adult as a child and as like a friend and as like a cool kid to hang out with. And like, for some of it, it's like having drinks with him. And for some of it, it's just, he likes family vacations again. It's less bittersweet because I'm just so happy with how this summer has been. And I'm so excited for his future. Thank you for listening to A Place of Yes. Please follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you really like this episode, please share it with a friend, anybody who might benefit from listening to this. It would make a world of difference if we could just reach more people and share the work that we do and the stories we want to tell. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, leave us a thumbs up or leave us a comment. We would appreciate all that you can do. If you really like this episode, please share it with a friend or two.